We're in Mark 10, and last week we finished up Mark's account about the rich young ruler. And of course, that account ends with Peter asking in verse 28, "We've left everything to follow you." And anyway, David had brought up Matthew's parallel account because Matthew doesn't end all of Jesus' teaching on this episode at this point. Matthew expands it a good bit. And what Matthew tells us is really, really beneficial. And so rather than just launching right into our outline here that is on the podium back there and starting in verse 32, I thought we'd go back to Matthew tonight and look at the end of Matthew 19 and then Matthew 20, because again, it is relevant. It is the fullness of Jesus' teaching relative to the rich young ruler, and it's something that I think is a blessing to us all. So notice Matthew 19. Let's begin with verse 27. Matthew 19, verse 27. So Peter answered him, that is Jesus, "We have left everything to follow you." Now, that's where Mark ends Peter's statement, but Matthew adds to it. And Matthew adds this question, "What then will there be for us?" Well, that's an interesting question. And so in response to Peter's question, since we've left everything to follow you, we've made these sacrifices, what's in it for us, me and the other apostles, notice what Jesus says, verse 28, and this is not in Mark's account. Jesus said to them, "Truly I tell you, at the renewal of all things," now that's the NIV's translation, "when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." Now clearly, whenever Jesus speaks here about you who have followed me, he means, in this case, exclusively the 12. And we know that's the case because he says, "You who have followed me will sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." So he's talking about the 12 apostles. So, what's in it for us? Peter asked. Now, another reason why I do this is because I think that this is going to be really relevant later in Mark 10 when we notice the request of James and John, when they say, "Lord, grant us in your glory for one of us to sit on your right hand and another to sit on your left." I think that this was part of what was playing in their minds that caused them to ask that question. Well, Jesus said, "Listen, great things are in store for you." Now, he said that this will take place, verse 28, in the NIV, "at the renewal of all things when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne." Now, like I said Sunday, there are no perfect translations, and I love the NIV, and I do believe in a renewal of all things as taught in Acts 3, verse 21, but I don't think that this is the best translation right here, because this makes it sound like that sitting on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel, will be a blessing, a privilege bestowed on the apostles after Jesus' second coming. But, there may be some aspect of that. Revelation 21, in the description of the New Jerusalem, it seems like there is some degree of special status for the apostles. So there may be some of that, but I don't believe that this has reference to a privilege that the apostles, as envisioned here, will exercise after Jesus' second coming. I think that this is something that the apostles are exercising right now. So this phrase, "at the renewal of all things," it's just literally something like "in the regeneration." This Greek word, which, by the way, the Greek word literally just means again born, born again. New birth, regeneration. And it occurs 2 times in the New Testament, this being the first, but the second time is in Titus chapter 3. Look at Titus 3 for just a minute. So Titus 3, verse 5. The churches in Crete were being troubled like we see in Philippi with some Judaizing teachers, and so Paul is teaching contrary to the claims of the Judaizers. In Titus 3:5, we're told, if I can find my spot in my Bible, He saved us, not because of righteous things we had done, but because of His mercy. He saved us through, now note this, the washing of rebirth. Rebirth is the word that's translated back in Matthew 19:28, at the renewal of all things. The washing of rebirth and renewal by the Holy Spirit. So, of course, we recognize that as a reference to baptism. You remember what Paul says in Romans 6? Whenever we're buried by Christ into baptism, our old man is buried. Our old man is put to death, and we're raised with Christ. We're resurrected with Christ out of the waters of baptism, and we come up out of the waters of baptism to live a new life. So there's a rebirth. It's what Jesus described in John 3:5, that unless you're born, and the Greek word could be translated again, it could be translated from above. I actually think in the context from above is the better idea. Unless you be born from above of the water and the Spirit, you can't enter into the kingdom of God. And so it's that idea. It's being born in water. So the point is, when is it? When is the regeneration? When are people being born again? Well, it's now. It's that point in time from Pentecost until Jesus' second coming. And of course, the time frame is further described in Matthew 19:28 by saying, when the Son of Man sits on His glorious throne. Well, you remember the sermon that Peter gave in Acts 2. Acts 2, beginning in about verse 29, Peter makes the point that, hey, Jesus is now sitting on David's throne. He's glorified at the Father's right hand. So now, during this time when people are being regenerated in baptism, while Jesus is sitting on His throne, and of course, beginning of that is Pentecost, end of that will be the second coming, then, during that time, the apostles are going to be sitting on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, of course, by the 12 tribes of Israel, what's meant is not fleshly Israel. What's meant by the 12 tribes of Israel is the church. Remember earlier, a couple weeks ago, we did a sermon on Philippians 3, verses 1 to 3. Again, where Paul is warning about these Judaizing false teachers. And Philippi was a Gentile church. They didn't even have enough Jewish men to constitute a synagogue in Philippi. Remember, Paul, whenever he'd go to a new town, his first thing was to go into the synagogue and preach in the synagogue. And then after rejected by the Jews, then he would go out and turn to the Gentiles, right? But what was the first place he went to preach when he went to Philippi? A riverside where some women were praying. There's not even 10 Jewish men. Philippi is a Roman colony. But to this Gentile church in Philippi, what does Paul say? Philippians 3:3. We are the circumcision who serve God by the Spirit, who boast in Christ Jesus, and who have no confidence in the flesh. Galatians 6:16. Paul, writing to these churches in Galatia that are primarily Gentile churches, he says, as many as walk according to this rule, peace on them and upon the Israel of God, Galatians 6:16. And, you see Paul's theology of all of this in Romans 9, 10, and 11. How that, unbelieving Israel are like branches cut out of the olive tree, and believing Gentiles are grafted in. And so now we're a part of that family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob by faith. So the 12 tribes of Israel are the church, and the apostles, during this time, they're sitting on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, when we think of judging, we think more in terms of being accused of a crime, and, your case is heard by a judge, and the judge pronounces you guilty or innocent. The idea here is just ruling. That's the idea, ruling. And right now, the apostles are ruling the church by means of their doctrine. Right? We continue steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine. And so that's what Jesus is saying. You apostles who have left everything behind to follow me, listen, you're going to be ruling the church. You're my representatives from Pentecost until the second coming. And then we find much the same thing that we saw in Mark chapter 10, verses 29 and 30. Notice Matthew 19:29. And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or fields for my sake. So these would be people who had to sacrifice in order to follow Jesus. Thankfully, most of us haven't had to do that. But many people around the world have to do that. This is a lot of, if you're in a Muslim country and, you're disowned by your family, if you put your faith in Jesus, this would be a situation they would find themselves in. For the Jews, this was a situation, Jews who would become Christians, this was a situation they would find themselves in. They would lose inheritance. They would lose houses. They would lose their relationships with their siblings, their relationship with their father or mother, maybe their relationship with their wife, with their children. They would lose family inheritance. But Jesus said those who suffer in that way will receive 100 times as much now, in this age. And of course, Mark's account is a little bit more explicit. In other words, in the church, we're blessed because we share in the church. We take care of those who don't have in the church. The relationships we lost in the world, we gain in the church. But then Jesus goes on to say, and will inherit. So now is the eschatological aspect. Here's what you'll get after Jesus comes again, and will inherit eternal life. And so then he says, but many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. So this great reversal. So many who are first in this life, like that rich young ruler was. He was on top. He was first of everybody in terms of power and in terms of wealth. Well, in the end, he's going to be last because he wasn't willing to leave it for Jesus. So at the judgment, he'll be last. And many who are last, those who don't have anything in this world because they've left, houses, brothers, sisters, father, mother, wife, children, fields, for Jesus' sake, they're last in this world. Well, they'll be first in the world to come. And then David pointed out that this statement in verse 30, many who are first will be last and last will be first, brackets, it's repeated in chapter 20 of Matthew, verse 16, and it brackets this parable. And I would argue that this parable is still an answer to Peter's question, what will we have? And so it answers this question as to what Christians ultimately will have. So let's read the parable and then we'll make some comments. So begin in verse 1 and we'll read down through verse 16 of Matthew 20. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for a day and sent them into his vineyard. About 9 in the morning he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, "You also go work in my vineyard and I'll pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out again about noon and about 3 in the afternoon and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon he went out and found others still standing around. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day doing nothing?" "Because no one has hired us," they answered. He said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going to the first." The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came, and each received a denarius. So when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "These who were hired last worked only 1 hour," they said, "and you've made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day." But he answered one of them, "I'm not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I will give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money?" Or are you envious because I'm generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last. So here you've got this man that owns his vineyard. And, it's harvest time. Work's got to be done in the vineyard. So, he goes to the market, in the morning. And so, you'd work from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. You go to the market the first hour of the day. And he says, hey, work in my vineyard, and I'll give you a denarius for your work today. And, a denarius was just, you see this in other texts, that was just the average day's pay for a day laborer. And so they agreed. So important point is they enter into an agreement with this man. All right, well, the day progresses and there's a lot of work to do, and he hasn't hired enough people to do the work. So, 3 hours later, about 9 in the morning, he goes and he sees people standing doing nothing, and he offers them a job. But now he doesn't enter into an agreement with them that is of a specific amount that he'll pay them. He just says to them, you go work in my vineyard, verse 4, and whatever is right, I'll pay you. And so they went. And, the day progresses. 3 hours later, it's noon. And, he still doesn't have enough workers, and there's a lot of work to do. So he goes out and he does the same thing. He hires them, and he says, I'll pay you whatever's right, but he doesn't agree to a specific amount. And then the day progresses, and, about 3 in the afternoon, he does the same thing. And then finally, 2 hours later, 5 in the afternoon, there's just a day, just an hour work, excuse me, I can't get this right. There's just an hour left in the work day. And so he goes out and he does the same thing. You work in my vineyard, and whatever's right, I'll pay you. And so anyway, they go and they work. Well, verse 8, at evening, it was Israelite law that you have to pay everybody their wages for that day at the end of the day, right? You see this in lots of passages. Maybe I'm derailing us by looking at one, but look at Deuteronomy 24. Just to illustrate how parables, though made up, were true to life. Parables are not like fables. So look at Deuteronomy 24, verses 14 and 15. Deuteronomy 24, verses 14 and 15. Do not take advantage of a hired worker, and that's what these people were in the vineyard, who is poor and needy, whether that worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner residing in one of your towns. Pay them their wages each day before sunset, because they are poor and are counting on it. Otherwise they may cry to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin. And so that's why now, end of the day, before sunset, he's going to pay everybody their wages, right? So, back to Matthew 20, verse 9, everybody who was hired, they come, and he begins doling out the wages, and he begins with those who were hired last, and he moves on to those who were hired first. So verse 9, those who were hired at 5 in the afternoon, how much do they receive? A denarius. They received the amount that he agreed to pay those he had hired the first hour of the day, those who had worked all day. Gives them the same. So we're told, verse 10, when those who were hired first came, they expected to receive more. But you know how much they got? They got a denarius. They got the same amount. And so, they began to murmur. And they say, listen, it's not right. You paid those who were hired last the same amount that you paid those of us you hired first. You made them equal to us. And listen, verse 12, we've borne the burden of the work in the heat of the day. Grape harvest was in August. And, I don't know that August would be quite as bad as August in Dallas, but, August anywhere is, well, I guess except in the southern hemisphere, August anywhere in the northern hemisphere is going to be pretty miserable. So hey, we thought we should have received more. And so the answer is given, verse 13, I'm not being unfair to you. Didn't you agree to work for denarius? Verse 14, you go and you take your wages and you go. If I want to give to the one who was hired last the same that I gave to you, isn't that my right? It's my money. I could have just gone out and just given the denarius to everybody who was standing in the market. I gave you what I agreed to give you. Why are you envious because I'm generous? And so here it seems to me that the point of the parable is, in terms of eternal reward, everybody gets paid the same. Those who spent their lives serving the Lord, those who were raised in a Christian home, and they were baptized young, and they lived long lives, and they served God and sacrificed for God all their lives, their eternal reward will be the same as the person, who right near the end of their life, after living a profligate, lustful life, they turn to the Lord. Everybody's pay is the same. And so what's the meaning of this statement? So the last will be first and the first will be last? Well, it meant one thing back in Matthew 19, verse 30, but it seems like it's got a slightly new twist here. And so in terms of the ratio of pay to work, the last will be first, and the first will be last. I think
there's one more thought.
Okay, please.
I think, in a way, Jesus is saying, now, Peter, don't get the big head, because you left all and followed me.
Right.
You too, James and John.
Right.
And he tells this parable, which had applications for them as well as for us.
Sure.
And of course, all these people in the parable are church members.
Right.
And the late Burton Kaufman makes quite a bit out of this in his commentary on Matthew. He sort of said that the one who is so ticked off by this and the unfairness,
right,
perceived unfairness, is the one who has been in the kingdom longest. And
right.
you would have think would have picked up on grace, but maybe didn't.
Sure.
Okay, so anyway, there's all sorts of lessons, I think,
right,
swirling here for the apostles as well as for us.
I think that's a great point. I think a good illustration of this is the Apostle Paul. Look at Paul, 1 Corinthians 15, and then we'll look at 2 Timothy 4. 1 Corinthians 15 and then 2 Timothy 4. First Corinthians 15, look at verses 9 and 10. For I am the least of the apostles, and did not even deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. Peter didn't persecute the church. Peter was persecuted from the very start. James, we may or may not make it to James and John's request, but, James was the first martyred among the apostles. He didn't persecute the church. He was the first to be persecuted. So Paul says, listen, I'm the last to become an apostle, and I'm the least of the apostles because of my former life as a persecuting Jew. But notice what he says, verse 10. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and His grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them. Yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. We know a lot more about the Apostle Paul's ministry than we know about the next, perhaps, than the apostles that we know the next most amount. That didn't come out right, but anyway, Peter and John. We still know a lot more about Paul than Peter and John. And Paul says, I worked harder than all of them. I worked harder than Peter. I worked harder than John. I worked harder than James. I worked harder than Matthew. And certainly, I can tell you, Paul has worked harder than me. But what will we have? Look at 2 Timothy 4. Second Timothy 4, look at verses 6 to 8. Paul said, for I'm already being poured out like a drink offering. So he's on death row, he's about to die. But he said, already, like this libation, I'm already being poured out like a drink offering. My life is already beginning to depart from me. And the time for my departure is near. I'm a condemned man. I have fought the good fight. I've finished the race. Remember the race that we noted Sunday, Philippians 3, 1 Corinthians 9, Acts chapter 20. Here Paul says, I've finished the race. The goal is near. You know, I'm about to cross the line for my prize. I've finished the race. I've kept the faith. Paul says, now there's in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but unto all who have longed or literally loved his appearing. Do you love the second coming of Jesus? Do you long for the second coming of Jesus? Well, Paul says that we'll get the crown that he gets, even though he certainly labored more than us. You know, we made the comment, I don't know at what point it was in Mark, but, you know, I do believe that there are degrees of punishment in hell. And I think that there are multiple texts that teach that. Because the thing is, those who go to hell, they get justice. They go to hell because of justice. The wages of sin is death. They get what they've earned. And some have sinned more than others. Now, everybody dies for all eternity. Everybody is punished in hell for all eternity, but some people's punishment is worse because they've sinned worse. But nobody goes to heaven because of justice. Everybody goes to heaven because of grace. Everybody has sinned. Nobody deserves to go to heaven, not the Apostle Paul, not anybody. Anybody who makes it there makes it by grace. And so, by God's grace, we all get the same reward, the crown of righteousness. So that to me is it's just a glorious, comforting thought. Any comments before we turn back to Mark? All right, and by the way, that's why it's helpful to get you a study Bible or Mark's got a book that gives puts all the four gospel accounts together, and that's why it's helpful to look at what especially the synoptic gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, put together each of their accounts of the same event. Because you really get a fuller picture of what happened when you do that. And this was a great example of that. Okay, so Mark chapter 10, let's look at verses 32 to 34. And by the way, what time is it?
7:31.
Okay, so we got 14 minutes, or 13 and a half. All right, so let's look at Mark 10, verses 32 to 34. We're told they were on their way up to Jerusalem, with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again he took the 12 aside, and told them what was going to happen to him. We're going up to Jerusalem, he said, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death, and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise. So, if you've got an NIV, you see the heading of this section is Jesus predicts his death a third. There's occasions when Jesus predicts his death. And anyway, we'll say a little bit more about that here in just a moment. But, there's a pattern that follows. Each time that Jesus predicts his death, it's followed by the disciples really showing their misunderstanding of the true nature of the kingdom. I mean, after Jesus predicts his death, each time, one or two or multiple of the disciples fall flat on their face, spiritually speaking. So we see in verse 32 that they're on their way up to Jerusalem. So remember, we're just a short time away from Jesus' death. Right? Remember how we noted Jesus crossed over from Galilee. He's not going to go back to Galilee before his resurrection. So he crossed over from Galilee and he's gone in the region of Perea. And, that region which is, right here, which is, to the east of the Jordan River. Okay, so they're headed to Jerusalem that way. Okay, and they're going for the Passover festival. And so Jesus is leading the way. And we're told that the disciples are astonished. And, this is the same word that we find back in chapter 10 and verse 24, where the disciples are astonished over the deal with the rich young ruler. And maybe they're just still astonished over that. They're still just in their mind mulling this over. How could this rich young ruler not be saved? And we're told that other disciples were afraid. And, maybe they're afraid because they see this opposition against Jesus mounting. For instance, back earlier in chapter 10, you see these Pharisees who come and they're tempting Jesus with this question on divorce. And so maybe, because of this mounting opposition, they're afraid. And so anyway, while he's on his way to Jerusalem with the 12 and then with a larger group of disciples, right? And we know among this group, we'll see this a little later on, there are women and others. We don't know exactly how big this group is, but it's more than just the 12. Oh, and by the way, my proofreading is bad. C, I've got perhaps I've got, perhaps because of Pharisaic opposition, perhaps still over Jesus' interaction with the rich young ruler. Those aren't sentences. There should be a comma, and they should go with the earlier sentences. So excuse my typos. Anyway, but then Jesus takes the 12 aside, and to the 12 he explains what's going to happen when they get to Jerusalem, and just to the 12. Right, so there are some differences. If you compare this prediction of Jesus' passion with the two previous predictions of Jesus' passion, there are some differences. First of all, one of the differences here is that Jesus makes the point that he's going to be betrayed to the Jewish rulers. Notice verse 33. We're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and teachers of the law. So he's going to be betrayed to the Jewish rulers. Now, of course, we know when we get to chapter 14, that betrayal will happen through one of Jesus' disciples. So, Judas, who's going to betray him, Jesus is telling this to Judas because he's one of the 12. And Jesus doesn't spell it out, but Judas is going to betray him. So that's a new detail from what was told in the two previous accounts. And then we see that the chief priests and the teachers of the law, they're going to put him on trial. And that's implied because of this word condemn. They will condemn him to death. Condemn, this is a word that will be the result of this trial. So he's going to be betrayed to the Jewish rulers, and the Jewish rulers are going to condemn him to death. But of course, in order to put him to death, that's not something the Jewish rulers can do themselves. Notice what follows. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles. You remember, Andrew made this point Sunday, that Israel was not an independent kingdom at this time. You remember, God brought Israel out of Egypt, and through Joshua gave them the land. And then, from about 1400 BC until about 586 BC, you had the nation of Israel, or the nation of Israel and the nation of Judah, existing under the leadership of judges or under the leadership of kings. But then Israel went into Babylonian captivity. And they're in Babylonian captivity for 70 years. When they're finally allowed to leave Babylonian captivity, they're not allowed to reestablish the monarchy. After 586, there's no more king in Israel from David's line. Right? And so they exist then for a period of time under various pagan powers. Under the Persians first, and then under the various Grecian empires. First under the Ptolemies, in Egypt, and then under the Seleucids in Syria. And then, with Judas Maccabeus and, the Maccabean revolt, all of that, there's about an 80-year window from about 140 until about 64 BC when Israel exists as an independent nation. Just an 80-year window. But then when the Romans come in, they lose all that. Pompey establishes Roman dominance in the east, and then, again, Israel is under Roman authority. And the Romans won't allow the Jews to put anyone to death. They don't grant them the power of life or death. And so, after the Jewish court, the Sanhedrin, condemns Jesus to death, that's why they have to go to Pilate and demand that Pilate put him to death. And, they kind of were strong-arming Pilate because there had been several Jewish revolts, revolts too strong. There had been some Jewish riots, and so, Pilate was, under scrutiny by the emperor, over that, so he didn't want another riot, and so they kind of strong-armed Pilate. But notice what they say to Pilate. Look at John chapter 18, and I've got the verse here in your outline. John 18. Look at verses 31 and 32. So, there are actually 3 trials that Jesus experiences under Jewish authorities, and then there are 3 trials that Jesus experiences under Gentile authorities. Okay? And so Pilate and Herod Antipas and Pilate again don't find any reason to put Jesus to death. And so, he tries to set Jesus free. And so he says, verse 31 of John 18, Pilate said, "Take him yourself and judge him by your own law." But then they say, "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. Now, John adds this reason for all of this. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Because remember what Jesus had said several times before this in John 3, and then also in John 12, that if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me. If the Jews were to put Jesus to death, how would they do that? They would stone him. But Jesus can't die by stoning, because remember what Jesus is. He's the Passover lamb. And that would break the type, because remember with Passover lambs, Exodus 12, not one of their bones could be broken. So Jesus can't die by stoning. The way that Jesus dies is by crucifixion. Anyway, and there are prophecies about that. But anyway, so that's why Jesus has to be handed over to the Gentiles. Okay, back to Mark chapter 10. And then, we've got some more details concerning the Gentile treatment of Jesus. We're told that they will mock him. Well, who mocked him? We know that Pilate didn't mock him at first. Who mocked him? Well, Herod Antipas mocked him, because remember he had the initial trial before Pilate, and then Pilate, when he learned that he was from Galilee, sent him to Herod Antipas. And Herod Antipas first wanted to see Jesus perform a sign, but when he didn't perform a sign, then Herod and those in his court began to mock Jesus. But then, of course, after Herod sends Jesus back to Pilate, and Pilate just grants the Jews' request, and Pilate hands Jesus over to the soldiers to have him scourged, the soldiers mock him. Remember how they dress him up like a king, and they bow the knee, and they say, "Hail, Jesus." And then they'll spit on him. And of course we know that's what the soldiers did. Pilate didn't spit on him. As far as we know, Herod didn't spit on him, but the soldiers did. And they'll flog him. And then Mark's account says they'll kill him. Now, Mark's account doesn't go into detail as to how the Gentiles would kill him, but if you look at Matthew's account, Matthew chapter 20, verse 19, of Jesus' third prophecy of his crucifixion, Matthew adds the detail that he'll be crucified. Mark doesn't hint at crucifixion until we get to chapter 15. And then, of course, resurrection. 3 days later, he'll rise. After the prophecy, the type of Jonah, who was 3 days and 3 nights in the, great fish's belly. All right, any comments on this?
I found it a little interesting. I was reading Luke's account this week, and I found it a little interesting that they said Pilate and Herod never got along, but when Pilate sent Jesus over to Herod, they became friends. Like, Herod was enthralled with Jesus being sent to him, and after that, their dislike of each other subsided.
Right.
I'm like, that's kind of sick.
It is. Yeah, and you get a hint, maybe it was on a Sunday morning a couple of weeks ago, in answer to a question we referred to Luke chapter 13. And Luke chapter 13 talks about those Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. Well, Galilee was Herod's territory. And so you got these Galileans who traveled south to Jerusalem, and Pilate had them put to death. Now again, there was some of that, Pilate had abused his authority, especially early on. You read about some of that in Josephus. And so because of these riots among the Jews, Pilate wants to keep the peace. But you see how why the Jews were that way, because of the way Pilate treated some of the Jews, and you see why Herod may have been upset with Pilate. Herod ruled a lot longer than Pilate. Herod became tetrarch of Galilee and Perea when his father, Herod the Great, died in 4 BC, and he reigned until he was deposed in 39 AD. And Pilate just ruled over Judea from AD 26 to AD 36, so just a 10-year window. But that seems like some of the background for the enmity between Pilate and Herod. Other comments? Yes, ma'am.
Pilate was more like a political appointee.
Yes, he was. Yeah, because
So he could be removed whenever they wanted him to.
very true. Yeah, whenever Herod actually was granted the title king, but whenever he died, his kingdom, of course he's ruling under Rome, right? But his kingdom was broken up, among his sons in part, and so you had Archelaus, who ruled over Judea and Samaria, and so he ruled from 4 BC until AD 6. And there were some accusations that were leveled against him, and he was removed from power. So he began reigning the same time that Herod Antipas did over Galilee and Perea. But whenever he was removed from power in 6 AD, then Judea became a province, a Roman province. So you had these Roman provincial governors who ruled from 6 AD until the outbreak of the Jewish-Roman War in 66. So yeah, they're political appointees. That's right.